Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Eric Olden. Eric is a co-founder and CEO at Strata Identity, which is a multi-cloud identity orchestration solution. Eric, thank you for joining us for our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Boris. Appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure too. So, Eric, for the start, could you tell us a short story about your career path, what brought you to where you are right now, and what you guys at Strata Identity are up to these days?
Yeah, sure. So before starting Strata, I've been in identity management my whole career. Before starting Strata, I have been running Oracle's security and identity division and really got a very broad view of the largest enterprises and what they were doing with identity and how it scaled in the cloud, multi-cloud age. Before that, I had been the founder and CTO and CEO of two identity companies. The first one is Securant, and we had a product, Clear Trust, and that was in the web access management days in the late 90s. And then I started the first identity as a service company, Simplified, in 2006. And coincidentally, both of those companies were acquired by RSA Security, and been in standards all my career as well. I was one of the early co-authors of SAML and one of the co-authors of the IDQL standard today for policy orchestration.
Wow. A lot of experience in your industry. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of key tenets of multi-cloud resilience and continuity, and also about identity orchestration. So, Eric, could you tell us, start by explaining what multi-cloud resilience and continuity mean in the context of modern IT infrastructure?
Absolutely. So, as you're probably very familiar, the role of identity is central to the secure operation of applications. And if identity goes down, your applications are unavailable, or they should be. They should fail closed. And a lot of times they've got very explicit and detailed plans for resiliency of their applications and their data. But when it comes to the identity layer, oftentimes that's not as well considered. And what we've found is, especially with now that organizations run their applications and workloads on multiple clouds, both in the public cloud and on premises, there's a whole new set of challenges for resilient operations. And when you think about the first, most common one is if you're an organization that is using cloud identity, what happens if that connection to that cloud goes down or the cloud becomes unavailable? It happens to every vendor at some point. And what do you do? Do you have a contingency plan to fail over to another cloud provider, identity provider in the cloud? Do you have ways to fail over locally? It may be that your internet connectivity is down. So we think about continuity from a multiple identity provider standpoint. So if provider A goes down, then you have the ability to fail over to provider B, but also continuity between the cloud and on-prem, so that if something happens to the cloud connection, that you can fail over and continue operations using a local identity system. So continuity, multi-cloud, left to right and top to bottom. And thinking about that is really important because in the modern day, that user experience is everything. And so when people come in and they can't log in or they have a problem with their identity, it really looks bad upon the company that's hosting those applications in that website. So it's never been more important than it is today.
All right, good explanation. So, are there any specific considerations or best practices or standards that organizations should follow to achieve this resilience and protection in a multi-cloud environment?
Yeah, one of the new technologies that has come to the market is identity orchestration. And what that allows you to do is to put an abstraction layer between your applications and your identity. What would you do with this abstraction layer? Well, a couple things. One, it allows you to decouple the application from the identity provider. And that's important because historically, if you wanted to change your identity provider, for instance, you want to use one in the cloud instead of one that you've been running on premises, that meant that you had to rewrite your application to consume identity from the new system. Well, that takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money. People really don't want to spend their budget paying off technical debt. And so with an abstraction layer, you can change that identity provider with configuration. And so the abstraction layer presents a consistent experience to the application, but on the other end can swap out the old identity provider with a new one. So it's a nice way to add a lot of flexibility and allow you to modernize applications very quickly.
So, how does identity orchestration differ from traditional identity and access management approaches?
Well, I think the most specific difference is that identity orchestration was designed from the beginning to manage multiple identity providers. And it's not intended to be the identity provider, but solves the problem when you need to use more than one vendor. For instance, if you're using, say, Okta for your workforce and Microsoft for your customer-facing applications, now you've got two identity providers. And what orchestration allows you to do is to have those coexist. It's kind of like in the early days of virtualization, when virtualization allowed you to run Linux and Windows on the same piece of hardware. Well, virtualization and orchestration share that in common in that you can use more than one. And so if you have a use case where you have multiple clouds, or you're using cloud and on-premises environments, when you have more than one environment, that's the time to look at identity orchestration. It's really solving the many or the multi-cloud problem, the multi-identity problem. And that's what's really different. It doesn't replace what an identity provider does, but it makes multiple identity providers work together.
Okay, fantastic. With regards to privacy requirements such as the GDPR or CCPA, how does this concept contribute to improving organizations?
Yeah, well, very common use case in multi-cloud, even with smaller organizations, is that on the internet, it's very easy that you could become a multinational organization, meaning you have operations or you have customers that come from all over the world. And for instance, if you have a website that serves both European, EU citizens, as well as American citizens, then you're going to want to run and hold that data that's relevant to those different constituencies in different places. So your EU users, you're going to want to use a cloud data center that's domiciled in the EU somewhere. And you want to use a data center for your American data that's domiciled in the US. So you've got two clouds. And the way orchestration can help you there is to say, look, we can have one application that supports an identity provider in the US and a different identity provider in the EU. So you are able to respect the boundaries and the sovereignty of that data so you can keep the data in the appropriate place. And that allows organizations to comply with GDPR in a much more elegant way. So that's one example of how to do that and to benefit from multi-cloud. The second would be to demonstrate that you have effective controls in place. And this speaks to the policy. So when you're going through a compliance audit and you need to demonstrate that, in fact, you have controls that separate data or that restrict access to certain applications and data based on a user's identity, well, you're going to want to be able to demonstrate that those rules or policies are in place. And identity orchestration has a subset called policy orchestration. And we worked with a community to create a new standard called Identity QL or IDQL. And this standard allows you to consistently define your policy, even though it's implemented in a proprietary way in these two example domains, these two different clouds. So say one cloud is on Amazon, another cloud is using Azure, that the policies that govern access between those two clouds are not the same because they're implemented in different proprietary instances. And what IDQL does is it creates a third generic representation of that policy that's human readable and can be translated back and forth into the proprietary formats. Why would you want to do that? Because if you are trying to demonstrate compliance in an audit, that you can now print out all of your policies, even though they're in different places, and have a really consistent way to show that your controls are in fact in place and consistently enforced. So those are two of the big considerations, multi-cloud and policy orchestration, that we're seeing people focus on today.
Fantastic. That's a very comprehensive explanation. So I would like to ask you a personal point of view. What is the major misconception in the field of identity orchestration that you are kind of strongly disagree with?
Let's see. I think one of the misconceptions about identity orchestration is that it's only designed to do one thing. And depending on who you talk to, they may say, oh, identity orchestration, you use that for onboarding new users. You talk to other people and they'll say, oh, well, you use orchestration to modernize application. Well, the truth is, orchestration can be used for dozens of different use cases. And so one of the most common things that we find talking with our customers and our users is that, hey, did you know you can do a whole lot of things with orchestration because you can automate the experience about a user as they come in and register for a site. You can customize and tailor the experience using attributes from a lot of different sources. You can implement things like continual access evaluation protocol, or CAPE, which is a key part of zero trust, where you want to continuously authorize and authenticate every request. So there's a whole lot of things that you can do with identity orchestration, as opposed to thinking that it's just one thing. It can do a whole lot of different things depending on what your use cases are.
Okay. Let's drill a little bit at your company, Strata Identity. So what's something you or your team have recently achieved that you are really proud of?
Well, we're really proud of, most recently, we introduced the next generation of our cloud platform called Mavericks. And with Mavericks now, you can manage all of your orchestrations 100% with the visual experience. So you don't have to write any code. You don't have to do complex configuration. We have introduced a really simple to use way to manage things in the cloud. And we did this using a unique air gap architecture. So this is important because there's no dependency between our customers' environments and Strata's cloud, because what you use our cloud for is to configure your policies and your user flows and all of that. And then that configuration is securely distributed and pushed to the customer's cloud, to the customer's environment. And there's never a case where the customer's data about their users has to go through Strata's cloud. So we avoid, by design, a lot of the concerns that people have about personally identifiable data being in the cloud, or from a continuity and resilience standpoint, you don't have to have any dependency between your operations and Strata because there's no runtime dependency between the two clouds. So we've been working hard on that for the last couple of years, and we just released it a few weeks ago, and the response has been really very, very encouraging. So proud of that.
Fantastic. So, for example, if we take a life of average risk and compliance manager, who is our main audience, if there is one thing that they should start to prioritize right now that they are not doing with regards to identity management?
I think the lowest hanging fruit, the simplest opportunity is to start with identity orchestration. And the nice thing about it is you don't have to bet a huge proposition to make it work. You can start very small and get it working. And what people are doing with it right away is modernizing their legacy identity. And by doing that, you reduce the risk on the outdated technology, maybe, for instance, moving away from the HTTP cookie-based sessions and replacing that with a more secure and standardized SAML or OpenID Connect, OIDC. So that's a really nice way to upgrade your identity very quickly. And the second use case that we see people deploy is passwordless. And if there's one thing to kind of fix in your any environment, it's move away from passwords. And the role that identity orchestration plays in that is whatever vendor you use for passwordless multi-factor phishing resistant authentication, passkeys, whatever the technology is, all of those generally are supported with the identity orchestration platform. So you can mix and match the different authentication types to your applications without rewriting the application. So you can get rid of passwords for all of your applications very quickly without imposing a big burden or challenge to your end users. So those would probably be the modernization and deploying passwordless. Those would be the two things that I would recommend.
Fantastic. So if we look into the future of this space of identity orchestration and resilience, what is evolving in the face of what are future techniques that are evolving, like to prevent hacking and other phishing techniques?
Yeah, there's been a lot of interest and investment on Strata's part in uh, bringing artificial intelligence into this world. And the way to do that isn't just to throw the AI or ML logo on something and say, now
Mm-hmm.
it's better, but to be very pragmatic in how you deploy that, because the artificial intelligence is only as good as the data that it's built to consume and to manage. And so when you look at the scope of data that is related to identity, that's probably the most rich, fertile place to train algorithms. And we have a lot of that work investment that's happening at Strata, but also I'd like to recognize that it's the industry at large, and I think Microsoft has done some really powerful things, introducing this notion of a co-pilot. I think they've done a great job with that to make things automated that allows the security risk professional to even the odds, because the attackers, they're using AI to try and attack and exploit the systems we're trying to defend. So if you're not thinking about how to use AI to counter AI, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So I think in the very near future, we're going to see a whole lot of really compelling practical uses of artificial intelligence
Mm-hmm.
and generative AI in the security and risk management space.
Wow.
And we hope to be on the forefront and lead that evolution.
Fantastic. So you don't put .ai on your website because not yet.
Not yet, not yet. I think that, I've been doing identity for 27 years, and I've seen a lot of hype trends where, some buzzword comes along, everyone's talking about it. I tend to be slow to embrace a buzzword until I have seen that it actually is practical. I think the idea of just throwing marketing, whitewashing things out there is it doesn't help the industry. So we've been very deliberate about how we've been engaging with it. And no, we haven't put AI on the website, but that doesn't mean that we're not really interested in figuring out how to implement it. I do think that we're going to see AI fundamentally affect the way that large data sets are approached and the way that our attack surfaces, they're just so distributed, they're so fragmented today. It's impossible to keep up just with people. And software is going to help automate and integrate, but we really need the boost that large language models and generative AI are bringing to help with the scale. And I think the responsiveness of our ability to see a problem and do something about it is going to be accelerated in a good way with AI.
Yeah, I remember this year AI is a main buzz. Last year was, I think, Web 3.0. Then before that was blockchain, I think. So every year something. But I think I remember when I used to was myself IT engineer. AI was still main thing, but now with ChatGPT, it kind of became mainstream.
Yeah, it became mainstream at the end of this past year in 2022. I think I personally was very impressed with the Chat GPT 3.0, and then of course they released the upgrade 4.0. But it makes the point that I was sharing earlier is that it's only as good as the data that it's trained on. And once the AI is trained on up-to-date internet data, I think things are going to get really, really interesting. I know that there's a lot of concerns about AI getting out of control, and I think, we want to be mindful to really think about that. And, to that end, I've been reading a lot of science fiction and Asimov's Three Rules, and I think there's a lot of romanticism, that good and bad, about what can happen with AI that's been in science fiction for a long time. And I think it's always interesting when you're living in the current day and the things that you read about when I was a child are coming true. And now it's like, wow, that AI stuff is on my phone now, and I use Siri or I use Alexa. And my grandmother, she lived to be 99 years old, and she was
Wow.
born yeah, and she was born in San Francisco before electricity was commonplace in
Wow.
San Francisco, in the heart of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And before she passed, she was using a smartphone with FaceTime and talking to her great grandchildren. And I think, what does the world look like for her? And then I think about what the world's going to look like for my children. And that span of science fiction becoming real, I think
Mhm.
is very exciting.
Exciting times. So, if we summarize our interview, if someone who is listening to it would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would that be?
I would suggest if you're dealing with multi-cloud, where you've got the complexity of different platforms and different vendors, and if you're dealing with multiple identity providers, that taking a look at identity orchestration can solve a lot of problems related to refactoring applications and technical debt. And I would always encourage people to prioritize removing passwords from their organization as soon as practical. And when you can, use the multi-factor, use the more sophisticated authentication. It's worth it. It can be convenient today, and there's no reason not to get rid of passwords. So multi-cloud and passwords, passwordless.
Fantastic. So, Eric, thank you very much for this very informative interview. That's why all my questions. If I forgot to ask you something that you say you think that will benefit our audience, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think, well, appreciate you having me on. again, Boris. I think, we covered a lot of ground. One thing that I did want to elaborate on a little bit when I was mentioning all of the use cases that you can do with identity orchestration, it's helpful. I find it helpful to think about the 5 A's that go into security. So authentication, how do you verify the user is who they say they are? Access control, who can get to the right information and data? Authorization, what entitlements or things can they do within an application? Attributes, when you're doing attribute-based policy, access control, and so forth, you need to have trustworthy attributes. And the last thing is audit and administration. How can you verify everything that's happened and do things with a change log so you know from a risk standpoint what has happened? All of those 5 A's are something that you can do from a converged standpoint with identity orchestration today. So it's got a lot to offer, and I think it's going to have as big an impact in information technology as virtualization had within compute. So I really encourage people to take a look at Strata.io.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric. And I hope we will continue to hearing from you, maybe another episode on something else from your company in the future.
Thank you, Boris. Appreciate it.